Hello, friends. My name is Steve, and we're here today for episode 35 of Page Chewing. And we are here with a couple of friends. Kian, will you start us off with some introductions, please?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. My name is Kian and Ardalan. I'm an author, fantasy author. I'm quite active, like on Twitter and stuff. I published my debut 2 years ago, and what people are most excited right now and know me for is the. Sorry, I had echo in the background because I had the file open.
Nice.
And yeah, people know me mostly for 11th Cycle because it is coming now in 1st of February, and it is a Dark Souls inspired novel. And I'm really, really hyped to be here with all of you and talking about books.
Nice. And Taylor?
All right, so hi, I am Taylor from the BookTube channel Made Between the Pages. I am a co-host with Steve for Page Chewing. You've probably seen me come in and out of these. Sometimes they're hosted on my channel as well, and I'm very excited to be here today.
Awesome. And of course, our friend Zamil, back again. I'm surprised we thought you'd run away from us by now, but you for some reason keep coming back.
No, I always love to be here. I'm Zamil Akhtar. I'm the author of Gunmetal Gods and Lightblade.
Awesome. And it's funny whenever you hear someone say, "I met so and so in person," because of the pandemic, you think, "Wow, you met someone in person." But Zamil and Kian, you've actually met in person before. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I heard about Zamil in advance as soon as I started getting into the Twitter fantasy book scene. And I just saw his name all everywhere. And then I happened to be in Dubai, and there was some sort of online engagement. And I just reached out to him. It's like, hey, I'm actually in Dubai. I'd love to meet you. Would you be up for that? And, everybody knows how important social networking is. And it turns out he's a lovely guy and gave me some very sage and awesome advice, and has actually helped me. So, yeah, and he did make me cry, as discussed before. No, he did. No, he was really lovely.
I took him to IKEA, actually. The most
That's not what I would have expected. Even a little bit. I just imagine the two of you gallivanting around IKEA, like testing the beds and stuff.
It was a crazy barrel, but close enough.
You say that, but that sounds like my girlfriend's perfect dream date. She loves IKEA, so she would do that in a heartbeat.
So, if from what you can share, what advice did you give him, Zamil?
Oh yeah, he asked me like literally everything, but it's getting into self-publishing is really hard, and I know Kian already has published one book, but with the 11th Cycle, it's specifically dark fantasy, and it's specifically grim dark, and it's tough to break into it. So I told him everything I know, and all kinds of specific stuff about launching on Amazon and what you can do to get things in your favor, because it's really tough. Yeah, and I feel like it gets tougher like every year. There's so many authors, there's so many books, and it's just like, how do you get seen? How do you break in? But with 11th Cycle, I mean, everyone knows about this. Like, it's all over the place. So I think he's doing a good job.
I was gonna say, yeah, I've seen that book everywhere recently, and I hadn't. To be fair, I hadn't heard of it before a couple weeks ago. And then I've seen so many people posting about it. So clearly the advice to break in is working because I'm seeing it everywhere, and I'm very much interested in picking it up, So
thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, like one thing that stuck with me when I was discussing with Zamil, for example, I don't know if it's going to get me in trouble saying this, but there was when I asked him about NetGalley, like, do you do NetGalley? And he was like, no, like, don't do that kind of thing. And I'm kind of glad that I took his advice on that. I feel like just the hype surrounding the book and people sharing it around had, individuals, bloggers, reviewers reaching out to me and asking for art copies. So I definitely think there is a way to market your stuff if you know how to market it, where you don't need to put in money into stuff like that. Obviously, then the money goes into other stuff like making a really cool cover that attracts that kind of attention.
Speaking of the cover, it's a gorgeous cover. How did that come to be?
Yeah, so I had different ideas for the cover. At first, I was considering of doing something more like a dark, chiseled, and worn out mural with like all of these images of like the elders, which are the gods, and all of that. But it was after talking with actually Bryce O'Connor, really lovely guy as well, and he's like, "That's a great idea for like a trad pub cover, not one for a self pub. You want something which is like a singular figure, something that pops out, something that like if you're scrolling through Amazon's shopping cart, that it's clear and it grabs your attention and it doesn't want to let you go." And that's why I'm like, okay, I want to do a figure from the book, an elder guard. You have this being with 3 arms. You know, there's a lot of mystery around it. It elicits curiosity. I then reached out to an artist called Nino Is an Art Station, who does a lot of art which has that Dark Souls aesthetic. I knew who my market was, and I'm like, hey, can you do a cover like this? Gave him the descriptions, and he ran with it. He really went above and beyond and came up with something really, really cool. Then Sean T. King, who's also everywhere as a cover designer, took the cover art and came up with the incredible typography, and that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Yeah, something that I find interesting, you know, all of us pick our books by covers for sure. And what I find interesting to me as a reader is when I see realistic humans, like if you want to think of like Harlequin romance covers, you know, those feel to me like they don't work. But for some reason, a shadowy, more artistic, not realistic figure, as soon as I see it, I'm like, oh, what's this? You know, like Lightblade also has that, right, on the cover as well. So I think that there's something about a shadowy, fantastical looking figure that pulls most people in. I think that was a really good choice because it definitely caught my attention when I saw it as well.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that it was Dark Souls at first. So that's exciting for me as well. I am not good enough at video games to play Dark Souls games. I would just cry in a corner, but my husband loves them. So maybe I can get some insights from him. Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. You hit
Thanks.
the vibe with that cover. You hit the vibe.
Thank you.
With you know, it's like you said, indie and trad, the cover ideas are very different because when you go to, for example, dark fantasy or grimdark in trad, all you see are like, okay, this is like a sword, or this is like a helmet, or this is, you know, it's just like it's like very focused on these objects. I look at a Game of Thrones cover. That's a good example. And sometimes you get some other ideas, but you know, it's like very kind of conservative in thinking about how a cover should be. Whereas with indie, I feel like, you know, you sort of have to really impress the person who comes across the cover. You know, it's more about getting them to click on that cover in Amazon. You know, which is why it's like you said, you got to focus on like a singular image that makes people want to know more. So yeah, you know, your cover with the 3 arms, you know, I think that definitely did that. And I remember on the Reddit thread, people were like, "Whoa, why does this guy have a 3rd arm?" And like, you know, what you know, why does he have an extra arm? So you generated interest with that one small detail. So that was really clever.
That is very much like a consistent comment that people make, like, oh, he has 4 arms or 3 arms, and I like that actually. I think it adds to the mystery of like, is it 4, is it 3? I will also say really quickly is that I don't think that's always necessarily a rule. You do have Ryan Cahill, who I think specifically made the point that he wanted to go for a cover that is more traditional or trad pub rather than thank you. A cover that is more trad pub rather than indie cover, sort of. So I think you can make it work, but it's usually advised to do something with contrast and something dynamic. Yeah, but thanks.
Yeah.
What's interesting with Ryan's covers is they don't give anything away, and maybe that's what Trad Publishing is trying to do as well. I'm not really sure, but it's not a spoiler to say because people talk about it with the book. But there are dragons in Ryan's world, but there's nothing to tell you that on the covers anywhere. Whereas I think if I was like picking a cover, I would want a dragon on the front, be like, hey, look at this book, it's got dragons. So it was a very interesting choice. It clearly worked. It was just a very interesting choice that he made there to do that.
It's really funny you say that, because there's this recent special edition book that came out where like the main character is holding an egg, a dragon egg. And I did have one friend of mine who's like, why is he holding a football on the... So...
I mean, it is kind of football-esque looking if you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just staring longingly at this. Yeah, no, I just wanted to share that. Yeah. Hey, Andrew, what's up?
Yeah, and we are reading the 11th Cycle, and we're discussing it with Kian next month, end of January. So, was able to get my grubby little mitts on it. So, I just want to get through a couple comments really quick. And hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I picked up Gunmetal Gods strictly because of the cover art and name were so cool. Gunmetal Gods is another cover.
Just as good. Inside's just as good.
Yeah. And of course, our friend Andrew is here.
Hi, Andrew.
And Andrew, we're getting it on. I think there's one more spot on the forum that event filled up really quickly. So I think we have one more spot on there. So check that out. I'm starting it really soon. It's a chunker, so started early.
When Andrew says he's starting something soon, that means it'll be finished by next Tuesday. So,
by tonight,
yeah, just got to be prepared for that.
So Ken, what's the 11th Cycle about? What's the pitch for it?
So the elevator pitch is because I could go on and on about the different ideas, but I will say that it is a world that is Dark Souls inspired. I remember on Reddit, somebody tried to leave a negative comment and said, oh, it sounds really derivative. It sounds like a mix of Mistborn and Dark Souls. I'm like, that sounds awesome. That's really cool. It's pretty much that. It's very heavy on the world building. It's very grimdark. And I think there is a level of it where people who read it, they do come back to me. It's like, it's very raw. There are emotions that are there, the experiences that these characters go through. And I think to some extent, maybe that's also a little bit different in terms of grimdark, which is just there to shock you awake. This is something which is more like dealing with the deepest and darkest moments of like grief and going through trauma and coming out the other side anyway, and finding hope in that anyway. But yeah.
And Andrew had another comment. Zamil explained that scene in Gunmetal. Why? There's lots of scenes.
Which scene?
Yeah, there's a lot that you could be asking why. Why about?
There's one scene people dislike more than, or that shocks more people than most.
I have
other scenes.
a inkling of what you might be talking about.
Yeah, it's a big spoiler. So
yeah.
Yeah.
I just started. It's really, really good. I'm really hyped about it.
I wish I could go back in time and read it for the first time again. I've actually been thinking about, because I read it in the first week of January last year, and I've just been thinking about that whole experience again now that we're getting close to it being a year. I'm just like, oh, that was such a great time.
Yeah, it really was, getting to experience that and gush about it. I mean, I'll never stop yelling about that book, but I am excited that I can get to Lightblade now. I'm very excited. The gates have opened up for, before we go blog. I'm allowed to now. So I'm really excited to read that book for sure. Steve, you already read it, right? Lightblade.
Yeah, I enjoyed it quite a bit. Yeah. And Zamil, how is Gunmetal Gods 3 coming along? Are you working on that one? Or are you still? I think you had another project that you had in front of it, right?
No, I'm working on Gunmetal Gods 3.
So excited.
I'm finished with the first draft, so I'm working on the second draft now. I'm hoping to have it ready by April. So that's my target date right now. But of course, it needs a lot of work, just like any book. And yeah, I'm really excited. It's I'm not going to spoil anything about it, but there are a lot of things from the first book and from the second book that are in the third book, in the sense that, the second book was very different, but it combines a lot of the things that people might like from the first and the second. So I'm very excited to get it out there. But yeah, still a lot of work to do.
Well, Taylor and I are going to call dibs on that one. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think it's So
Yes.
we'll be harassing
Also,
you.
am I allowed to ask if my man's kin is in it? Is that a spoiler? Can I ask?
Yeah, okay. I'll reveal that the point of view characters are Kiva and Syra.
Okay.
So they are the point of view characters uh, of the story. So yeah, you will see the cast from both books, both the first and the second book, in this book. So yeah.
Okay. I'm
Yes.
excited.
And a question for Zamil. Is there a historic precedent for Death Riders? I found the concept very interesting. And I just want to mention really quickly, we did have an in-depth discussion for Death Rider on Taylor's channel, so be sure and check that out if you want to know more. That's a ton of information about that book, but Zamil, go ahead and if you want to take that one.
Yeah, so Death Riders are people who charge into the fray, and their purpose basically is to be fodder in a battle. And their purpose is basically to die so that the more elite forces can get ready to do their attack. And yeah, there is a historical precedent. In the Ottoman army, they had a regiment. I can't remember the name. It's something in Turkish. But they had a regiment of people who were basically just meant to charge in there, and their purpose was literally to just take the opening, bullets, and soak up all the damage so that the Janissaries could come in next. And this worked very well, for example, in the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. This was one of their big tactics, and they just had so many. Their army are just so vast that they could do this. So yeah, that is where the inspiration of the Death Riders came.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting to get a perspective from a character who's doomed from the start. You don't necessarily get that in such a way that, like, how are they going to escape this? It's not they're in the midst of a battle or anything like that. It's just you have a character that's like, yeah, my purpose is to die. It's a very interesting way to start a book, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And just want to mention that Death Rider is available on Zamil's website, and we can sign up for his newsletter. So a good way to grab that book, and it's about 100 pages. So I really think I finished it in one sitting, and then I thought about it I still think about it, but very impactful book.
I'll just show it. Here it's right here.
There you go.
A little baby book.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's actually my favorite cover of all the three books so far.
It's up there. It's hard
I like it a lot.
It's hard to choose.
But this book was actually, since we're talking about Dark Souls, Death Riders is the most Dark Souls-like book, I feel, of the Gunmetal Gods books. And it actually, when I wrote it, I was thinking a lot of Dark Souls because I had just read a book which Kian also just finished, An Altar on the Village Green by Nathan Hall. Yeah. So I just read this book. It's a Dark Souls-inspired book. And I told Kian, that's one of the things I told Kian to do, read this book when he met me. And I just read it, and I was like sitting down to write Death Riders, and a lot of the like Dark Souls inspiration from that book, and I also play Dark Souls, so a lot of it was like absorbed into me, and so that's sort of why Death Riders is like really heavy on the cosmic horror and the sort of sense of loss and the sense of grief. Also, that Kian mentioned, like the sense of grief that, this raw emotion that, yeah, I'm about to die. So here's my son. What am I going to say to my son? What am I going to say to this, this Shah, this king that I've served? What am I going to say to him? What am I going to say to all these people, now that I'm like, I know I'm going to die. So yeah, it's that sense is, the emotions were on that one. It's something also that maybe Dark Souls inspired me to do.
Well, since both of you have like some kind of Dark Souls inspiration in your works. For someone like me who casually knows the game, you know, the game, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word. The set of games that fall under that umbrella.
Series, yeah.
Series, there we go. That was the word I was looking for. How would you describe the distinct feel of Dark Souls? Because for me, basically, I've watched my husband play Elden Ring, and that was, you know, it's a very cinematic experience for one, but also it seems very, it feels hopeless. You know, I haven't seen the end of the game, so I'm not sure what if the end gives you a sprinkling of hope or not. He just made a sad face. I guess I wasn't trying to say you die. I was just trying to say, the atmosphere.
I enjoy dying.
He said he enjoys dying in the game, but it feels hopeless. It feels that way, and maybe it's purposeful. And a lot of the bosses seem larger than life. So that's kind of what I know about it. But I'm curious, as people who've included it in their works, how would you describe it? What inspired your book from that?
Okay. I'm going to try to keep this succinct because it is something that I've thought a lot about and I'm very passionate about. I think there are multifacets to the question. I really like the fact that you nailed like the sense of hopelessness in the world, or the sense that the bosses are larger than life, because it really is kind of constructed to be that way. The world is very much indifferent towards your existence, which is something that is not like when you read a high fantasy book, the protagonist is the center of that universe in a lot of ways. But Dark Souls is kind of like, no, the universe is harsh, doesn't care about you, and it's indifferent, and you strive to survive it regardless of that. I think for me, what became something that's really interesting is that a lot of people who were struggling with depression said that Dark Souls helped them with that, because of a lot of the symbolism of like, don't go hollow, meaning don't give up, you know, keep persevering, keep trying, keep pushing forward kind of thing. And I think it's kind of that, in a sense, the overarching idea of the world of like, it is dark, it is grueling, and maybe it is hurtling towards oblivion, like in Dark Souls 3. But even then, there's a shred of hope. I'm not going to spoil the end of Dark Souls 3, but I will touch a little bit on it. So if people don't want to hear, better not listen to this. But there is a sense towards the end that the world is ending. Everything is coming to be destroyed. But from that comes a spark of something new. And it's very much about Miyazaki, the creator, moving on to his next game. So even though Dark Souls, the franchise, is coming to an end, he's creating Elden Ring. There is still a new future, and it's bittersweet in a sense. And I think that's where I'll leave that at.
Yeah, that is well said. And you could talk about Dark Souls for hours and hours. And for me, it's just this vibe and this tone. And you know, when we talk about fiction, you know, any kind of fiction, we often talk about tone. Like, what is the tone of this work? And Dark Souls is a very particular tone, and it's everything that Kian just said. And you're just feeling it. You're just, you know, completely immersed in it. And like, it's just this sense that everything is decaying. Everything is, you know, basically in its last gasp. You know, this whole world is just in its last gasp, and it's just decaying, and it's about to just, you know, cease existing. And this whole process is not something that matters that much. You know, there are these higher entities, and for them, you know, this is just like a cycle. It's like when we breathe in and out, you know. So it's this sense that, you know, everything that's meaningful, everything that matters is like about to disappear, is about to vanish, and you're just this tiny little creature who's there, and you're not given any importance. You're literally called like a withered soul, and you know, you start with like no armor on, you're wearing rags, and you have a club, and you're given no importance whatsoever. But you're going on this mission to try to find the last hope, the last little spark of light that, it might lead to like the rebirth of the world and, a new beginning. And because you can't save the world, but you can lead the world into its rebirth, into a new beginning, into like a recurrence. And this is not like a permanent salvation. The world is going to decay again. This is just part of the cycle. So it's sort of this, it's and everything I'm saying, it's something that has to be felt. You can't really impart it with words. You just have to feel it. When you're in the game, listening to the music, seeing the environments, and dying like 30 times to this boss who's just impossibly massive. It's just a vibe. It's just a whole thing. It's become a genre into itself in that sense. Yeah.
And our friend Shadia dropped by. Hey, Shadia. And Bakara. It's okay if you're late. Danielle, hope you're having a good morning. And there's something powerful about seeing characters face such a dreadful world. It's inspiring.
What
So
stuck
true.
what stuck out to me about what you just said there, Zama, was that you can't save the world, but you can hope for a rebirth, which is a very unique storyline, I would say, in fantasy. Not that it's always you're saving the world, but it's either you're saving the world or the world can't be saved and that's it. Very rarely do I hear people say that you can't save this one, but maybe the next one, right? And that actually brings to my mind what Kian said earlier about Mistborn being a possible inspiration, because Mistborn also has this decaying, blackened world. And it really, it's not a spoiler to say that it also feels hopeless. And the question is, can it be saved? Maybe it can't. So that sounds like a very good summary, what you mentioned earlier with the Mistborn and Dark Souls thing. Yeah, it's intriguing. I wish I was good enough at games to play them, but I just watch people play them because I can't. Dying the 30th time, I'm like, why am I wasting my time? I just go read a book instead. So it's not for me.
Well, now there's an official Dark Souls novel, which I found interesting. I have not read it, but it's been released. It's like an official novel. I have no idea if it's good, but
I
that's
know.
something.
Sorry,
Check it out.
I've heard really bad stuff. I've heard people even say that it has no connection to the games.
Oh no.
Yeah, but I
You
mean,
should have gotten you to
like,
write it.
yeah, no, it's
Hire you.
why you write it. But to what you just said, Taylor, like that's exactly kind of what I was setting out to do, capturing that feel of Dark Souls through a novel experience rather than through the games. And I think I could go on and on about like just praise the games, but I think something that I found really interesting is just the meta awareness of what the game is. It really, so for example, some of the symbolism in there is like if you as a human being in the game, if you keep dying and keep being reborn, and that's kind of like the death mechanic. So it's not a checkpoint. When you die, you just start again and again, and it's part of the lore. And the more you die, the more you become hollowed, the less life points you have, and the more you're just repeating the same cycle. And that sounds maddening. And going back to Nathan Hale, and his An Altar on the Village Green, that's kind of like the idea of this repetition and going numb of Sisyphean, like just beginning all over again. And I think it's really interesting because it's basically saying that if you put down that controller and you stop trying to face it, you kind of went hollow. And it's not trying to like insult you for that. It's like, that's your choice that you made. Simply deciding not to continue is saying, and you being part of that universe of like, I was one of those people that is actively participating. And I love that idea. And I don't think you quite often get something like that, which is so subtly just kind of giving you a slight nod. Like in 11th Cycle, something that I came up with, which I'm really happy about, is the idea of the forgotten curse. And the idea is that any character at any point in the story can inexplicably be erased from the memory of anybody who lives in that world. And they won't know who that person was. They'll just feel this kind of very present hole where a person used to be. and any evidence or any idea of who that person once was is gone from your memory and from existence. And I think like that's also something like you just read it and I wanted the reader to kind of have this idea of like reverse amnesia or Alzheimer's, even of you just kind of having this existential fear. And I really like that from Dark Souls as well.
You had both mentioned conveying, grief and loss. What's the I don't want to say the correct way, but how do you approach that kind of storytelling without it feeling unearned or cheap? How do you approach telling those types of stories?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to do, and readers react to the presentation of grief in different ways. So in my books, I always try to portray things viscerally and with immediacy. So like if someone, like Gunmetal Gods especially is about grief. It's about how these two characters, Micah and Kiva, process the grief over their lost loved ones. And you see that they process these grief, they both sort of process this grief by becoming angry and channeling it into violence. But while they have that similarity, there's also a lot of differences underneath. But I try to just portray the whole journey and portray it from the very beginning, and they sort of say that you go through stages, that's sort of what they say. But personally, I don't think it's that clean. I think that you might, for example, a month after you lose someone, you might be starting to feel better, but then you might revert immediately back to that first stage, that first sense of loss. So I try to show that it's a messy thing, it's a raw thing, it's a visceral thing, and it stays like a specter. It's like a ghost. It hangs over the character for the remainder of their journey. It's not just like one chapter, I'm going to mourn and now I'm going to go with my sword. No, it just stays there. It's a ghost. It's haunting you. It's always there. It's always, intruding into your mind. And Kian, both of us write in first person. So I've actually read 20% into 11th Cycle. So I've noticed that these characters will have these thoughts that come in that sort of intrude upon, what they're doing at the moment. And a lot of these thoughts are about the people that they've just lost, and it's very, I found it very powerful. I'm only 20% in, but already there's, like you said, already he's tormenting the reader with horrible things. But I felt a lot. I felt like the raw emotion that you described. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to do, but when you do it well, it's very rewarding for you as an author.
Just a small comment there is something I always say to myself and others is grief is not linear. So I just really appreciate what you said right there, because, this doesn't have to be super personal, but my grandmother recently passed, and I can say, from personal experience, it's not a linear thing, especially being across the world. Really, if you're away from someone when they pass as well, that complicates the feelings too. So I just really appreciate the nuanced take that you mentioned, because I think that's really realistic. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
I also really quick, I absolutely 100% agree with what Zamil said, and I would also tack on to that the idea that this cloud that hangs over you, it never leaves you. I think the best that you can ever hope for is acceptance, to be able to live with that, what has happened, and I think that's what helps people grow and mature. I think one concept that I've recently, over the past few years, understood that helps me write grief is about every single person has an idea of reality, of the kind of reality that we've constructed about ourselves and what we expect our days to be like from the moment we wake up. It is when you throw a wrench into that reality, when you shatter the foundations of what you thought is true to the world, when that kind of causes you to fall into a matter of grief. So if you have a young girl whose mother suddenly dies, that's that's a moment where your reality shatters. That's a moment where you kind of start going through the process of disbelief and anger, and having to pick up the pieces and build something new with that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. It doesn't have to be grief for the loss of a person. It can also be grief for loss of a place or a time. Grief is pretty all-encompassing, right? I think nostalgia is interesting in that way too, because it often includes a little bit of grief in there, feeling a bit of grief for the past. I'm a 90s kid, so, we love nostalgia in my, in my generation, so. Yeah, Tamagotchis.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you said about grief for loss of place, because like in my life, I've moved around a lot. I moved around because of my parents, and every time I'd move, I feel like loss for the place that I moved from, and like, it was like a sort of grief, and I think that doesn't get explored that much in fiction. So that's a good that you mentioned that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have a story idea brewing now? Do I see the wheels turning?
Well, the second Gunmetal Gods book, Conqueror's Blood, sort of explores this. With Syra, she's ejected from her home and twice, but it's not like it's not like the focus of the book. But yeah, I've like personally me, I have this like disjointed concept of what my home is. Like here I am in Dubai, but I lived in the States, I lived in Saudi Arabia, I lived all over the place. So it's like sort of a rootlessness. So yeah, that's something I personally like to explore in my works.
I mean, as someone who hasn't moved quite as often as you, but whose life is split between two different countries for the foreseeable future, it is interesting because even when you return back to said place you might deem as home, it's changed on you. How dare it? It's like, wait, this is not what I remembered this place looking like. So it's a very unique, interesting, not unique. I think a lot of people have experienced this, but it's a very interesting situation to be in when home is a nebulous thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Zamil, I think how much does this play into progression fantasy in your view? Or I guess we should start with what is progression fantasy in your opinion?
Oh yeah, so Lightblade is a progression fantasy, and for me, progression fantasy, this is something they taught in, like, if you go to progression fantasy Reddit or something, they're always talking about what is it. But for me, it's mostly when when you have a character and they start weak at the beginning of the story, and there's a lot of focus on them getting stronger, and I play a lot of video games. I play a lot of RPGs, especially more back when I wasn't an author, because now I'm too busy writing. But yeah, exploring the concept of having a character start out weak, sort of like in Dark Souls. You start out with like wearing rags and just with a club, but by the end of the game, you're wearing like this crazy armor that can like block the most ferocious attacks, and your sword has like 12 effects on it, and you're casting spells and like summoning all kinds of creatures and stuff. So so think about that in book form, starting the journey from nothing to being absolutely powerful. So it's just going through that whole journey, and yeah, it's it's a lot of fun. It's very different from Gunmetal Gods, but it's just a fun thing that I enjoyed exploring.
I think I haven't read it yet, but the Cradle series, right? That's also progression fantasy. Am I correct on that? I think by Will White, I think it's progression fantasy. Yeah. But that genre seems to be very popular right now, I think. That's actually that's actually an interesting question for the both of you, who both of your books, at least Gunmetal Gods, Lightblade is more progression fantasy, but 11th Cycle also seems to dabble in the grimdark, genre. And I'm curious, Steve and I have talked to a couple people recently where we've heard people say, and we've said ourselves, that grimdark was the king, of fantasy for so long, but it seems like some other, subgenres are starting to kind of maybe take over its spot a little bit, being cozy fantasy or progression fantasy. So I'm curious for you guys, are you seeing that same trend, or do you still see a lot of grimdark being the most popular? Just not whether you think it's good or bad, but just what you're seeing.
So I'm just one guy. I could be wrong. But I'll say what my opinion is. I do think that there is this unfortunate habit of people to say that grimdark is better than most, if not all, genres because it deals with more mature topics. They say that it's better because a woman gets raped in it, and that is not. I think that should not be the foundation for what is good. And just because it deals with more mature themes, I don't think that's a reason for people to say that. On the other hand, I will say that stuff like progression fantasy, a lit RPG, stuff like that, it's successful because it appeals to a lot of people who have that escapism that they're looking for, and at the same time, they like the comfort that it's straightforward. And I found, and Zamil and we did discuss this, that people who tend to read lit RPG or progression fantasy are the voracious readers. They like to race through it. At the same time, when you compare it to something like Malazan, those are more like cult following. It's more steadfast following of people who just protect that series vehemently. So maybe it depends on the person that you're targeting towards. At the same time, I would say if you look at romance, I feel like romance novels have for the longest time just been one of the most saturated and most read, fiction novels in the writing sphere. So I think there are different ways to tackle it. Yeah. If anything, I will also say that I think that this shows a shift towards not necessarily a new genre, but towards new things to come. I'm pretty sure that Zamil, Nathan, and I aren't going to be the only Dark Souls inspired novels. I'm pretty sure they're going to be a lot more in that with that concept, and you're going to have some sort of evolution. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of these conversations with other authors about like what is going to be the next big thing, what is worth writing. Like as authors, we spend a lot of time writing these books. We want there to be an audience. It's not just like a vanity project. We want people to read them, and we want people to show up and to be excited about what we're writing. And there's been a lot of that, like you mentioned, Will White with the Cradle series. There's been a tremendous amount of that, and this sort of wasn't a concept in people's minds maybe three years ago. No one even heard of this progression fantasy. Whereas grimdark has been around for a long time. People know what it is. They know what to expect. There have been the original grimdark stories were written, and then people went in and sort of styled more stories on those, and then so there does with these cycles there does develop a sense that okay, I've read all these grimdark stories now, maybe, but progression fantasy, what is that? That's new. I've never read a story like this. It's like a video game. It's like like a shonen anime. I've never read a book like this, so it's like a new thing, and people are excited about it. And they're coming out now at a pretty fast pace, so people are picking them up and reading them, and they're cycling through them pretty fast. So this is sort of like the cycle of most things are like this. And obviously fantasy will always be popular. Fantasy as a umbrella subgenre, is there's always going to be fantasy readers. But what is popular within fantasy is going to change, is going to cycle. But I hope, ultimately, for me, it's not about grimdark or progression fantasy. It's like, what story do I want to tell? And how can I tell it in a form where there's an audience? Because I could write about, I don't know, I could have made Gunmetal Gods a historical fiction novel, Or, I could have told the same story in modern times, in people getting into a car accident or something and trying to kill each other. You can take these themes and put them into different forms, but you want readers to show up. So that's where you do have to sort of ask yourself, okay, is this genre too saturated? And if it is saturated, how can I stand out? I really want to tell this kind of story. So how can I stand out? These are all important questions, and the answer is difficult, because I could start a progression fantasy now, and then 2 years later, no one wants to read progression fantasy. It's happened. Books take a long time to write, so you don't know 2 years from now what is going to be the hype and what is going to be like the talked about genre. It's hard to say.
It's a really good point that, these cycles do just naturally happen as well. And something else I've noticed, I'm not on Book Talk. It's just not for me. It's just not going to be my thing. But I do know people who are hipper than I am that are on Book Talk. And so a lot of the recommendations on Book Talk, because it tends to run younger, a lot of the recommendations on there are recommendations from 10 years ago BookTube. So a lot of people who've been on BookTube for a really long time are like, oh, this reminds me of, 8-10 years ago on the other platform. So I think it's interesting that maybe the cycles could have a generational thing too. Maybe a younger generation hasn't or wasn't of the age to read grimdark, right? When it was big. And maybe it'll see, I say resurgence, it's not gone, I'm being dramatic, but maybe it will rise again into extreme popularity in another generation when they reach that reading age. It could be that as well. Just spitballing, but I'm noticing with Book Talk that there's definitely a trend there of books cycling back around.
Yeah, I'm not on Book Talk either, but I hope that the Generation Z or whatever they're called, I hope that they do sort of, when they come into the the market, they do read some of these things that were popular, like Mark Lawrence's books, for example, or even Malazan. These things which are more associated with millennials and above. I hope that they do get into these, because I think they're awesome stories, and but I don't know. That's sort of a blind spot for me. It's like, what are the different age groups, like what is Gen Z reading? That's something I've always tried to understand more of, because they're becoming more and more of the adult reading genre.
Yeah, go ahead, Kian. No, take it away.
No, sorry. I just wanted to also add that, for example, Pierce Brown Red Rising series, the first book starts off with something which is pretty much it was riding that Hunger Games hype train, and it was part of that cycle that you two were just talking about. But then ever since book 2, it became its own thing entirely. So I think that's also possible, where it's like, yeah, you're joining a hype train, and then it just trails off and finds its own identity and becomes its own thing. And you do have stuff, I feel like, where, I don't know, like even, going back to Dark Souls, you have something which is a niche fan base for one market, and you're like, hey, you like Dark Souls? Here it is in another medium. Maybe you'll like it. And I think, like, it's not just about what are book people reading, but it's in general, like, what are book people into? And I feel like that's probably also why lit RPG became such a loved genre, because it appealed to gamers who know what the system is like. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good point. And I wonder how much of that newer generation reading the books from 10 years ago, how much of that is parents recommending books to their kids, or the other generation just kind of recommending books to them. And Thiago Abdallah's, good morning.
Hi, Thiago.
Good afternoon, I guess. Is it afternoon for you, Thiago?
Hey, Thiago.
I've given up on keeping track of time zones. Can't even keep track of my own. So
we're all over the world, so it's hard to keep up.
Yeah.
Fazella reads, totally agree with Taylor. The new generation is picking up a lot of the earlier popular books now.
Yeah. I think for me, again, I don't have my finger on the pulse, of fantasy book talk so much. I just hear more what's generally popular and being talked about. Like Colleen Hoover had a renaissance over there. But I think what's interesting about book talk, and something that Kian just mentioned, is, I think we forget how small you're right, Steve, it is
1 p.m.
how small the reading culture of the world is, like avid readers and people who, read deep into fantasy or really deep into, subgenres. And what Book Talk has been able to do is reach outside of that to more casual readers in a way that I don't think BookTube has been able to. My guess is that it's long form content versus short form content, but that's just a complete guess. But an example to show this would be when I went back to the States, I walked into my Barnes and Noble and there was a Book Talk book table. And I had never in my life seen a reference to online book world in a brick and mortar store. And so to me, that was showing me that, okay, so Book Talk is doing something here that other platforms haven't done. And my guess is be able to connect with what other people with other interests want to read in the way that, a Dark Souls book would bring in a gamer, or a Colleen Hoover book might bring in someone who's into, just like every once in a while, a romance book, that kind of thing. I think it's a very unique intersection it seems to have. I'm not jealous or anything. But...
Really interesting.
Really quickly, because this was something that made me laugh a lot when Zamil and I met. Because you were asking earlier, Steve, about what is progression fantasy to you, and Zamil and I talked about. It's like, yeah. So I said this with absolute ignorance of like, yeah, I think it would be really interesting if you took like a progression fantasy and then halfway through the person lost all of their like progression or all of their powers and stuff. And Zamil was like, no, don't do that. You're gonna lose all of your readers. Yeah. So like, I think that's also, know your audience, obviously, but I think that would be more interesting because it's not as predictable of like, yeah, obviously the guy's going to get stronger because they're just getting stronger over time. Yeah.
Yeah, because progression fantasy has the readers have a lot of expectations. So it's not like normal epic fantasy where you go on a quest and you have the normal beats that we expect in there's like an epic villain and an epic confrontation and blah blah blah. It's not like that. So like in progression fantasy, people want like the level up. That's the big thing that they want. They don't care as much about all the stuff around it. That stuff does matter, but they want to see the character get stronger. They want that communicated to them, in sort of an intense way. So having the character become weaker is like the exact thing they don't want. So it's like, but that would be cool in epic fantasy, and in fact, I like that idea a lot. Like for epic fantasy, because it's like that's how you create tension. Like we're told as storytellers, to create tension, you have to make your character vulnerable. But in progression fantasy, you kind of want to do the opposite. You want to make them overpowered eventually, so that people can enjoy the thrill of the character just being overpowered. So it's like you have to rewire your storytelling a little bit, and it's more challenging than I expected actually to write one of those books when you've been writing epic fantasy mostly.
It almost sounds like a self-insert character, so people can feel like they're leveling up with the character. But you know what you got to do? You got to wait till that oversaturation happens and then write that. And people will be like, this is so new. So you just got to wait, But...
Yeah, and Fazila Reed's mentioned we have a dedicated book talk space here in UAE. Kinokuniya, too?
That sounds Japanese. Kinokuniya.
Kinokuniya, yeah.
Is that a bookstore?
Yeah.
Because here in the UAE, there's like Borders, and they sell toys.
Really?
Wait, you still have a Borders?
Yeah, but we have Borders here. It's amazing.
Oh my God, they all shut down.
They have this tiny corner for books, and then the rest is just toys. So it's bizarre. Yeah, I'm interested.
Kinokuniya
Where's that?
is. I believe that's at Dubai Mall. Last time I
Mm,
was there.
Yeah,
Yep.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
sounds really.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
name sounds
yeah, yeah.
extremely Japanese to me.
I
I've
think
never
it
heard of it
is.
before,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Kinokuniya.
Yeah, in Dubai
Yeah.
Mall. And Fazila Reads, it's a wonderful YouTube channel. Whoever hasn't, go check out the channel. Really great channel. Should have more attention there. So really great stuff going on there. Just want to mention that.
I second that.
I'm too far from Dubai Mall, so
Mm.
I'm not making a journey.
And Chiago says, make overpowered villains as well.
Hmm. Larger than life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious, because you mentioned villains. Don't spoil the book, Ian, but how do you approach writing villains? Because that's always one thing that, for me, separates like the authors I really love from the ones that are like I kind of enjoy. Like I kind of enjoy Brandon Sanderson, but the authors that I really love, it's just something they do with the villains. It's just something they do with like their approach to writing villains. So I'm curious.
That's a really good question. It's not that I struggled with that idea with 11th Cycle, but more the fact that I had to be a little bit creative with it, because 11th Cycle really does set up the world. There's a lot that happens in it, but it is what like gets the events rolling into the later books. And what I focus more on rather than villains is an antagonistic force. So each of like these all of these 5 different characters have a struggle that they are facing with. One of them, for example, I'm not going to get into spoiler territory, but it's not the fact that the antagonist for them is necessarily an individual or an entity. It's rather their own impression. It's their suicidal ideation. It's their coming to terms with the fact of like, in order to help others, they don't need to be so self-critical, kind of thing. And I think that was how I worked through it for this one. There is mention of like, it's not even a spoiler because it's on the back of the book, there's mention of this great evil, but it's written in more of this kind of like nebulous way, or this kind of like, it's like Satan in the Bible. It's they're represented as a force of nature, but there is no actual mention of them or no obvious influence of them throughout this first book. And I think that's my answer to you. I focus, at least within 11th Cycle, more on an antagonistic force for some of the individuals, and others they do either get a system that is against them, or they do get somebody who is actually really opposed with their goals. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Very, very good channel. Thank you for the shout out. You're doing some great work there. And also Fazila mentions it's a manga store, I think in other countries mostly, but here it's it's the biggest stores, I believe.
That makes sense.
And Thiago throws that question back at you, Zamil. What do you look for in a villain?
So a lot of my stories are driven by the conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist. So there is an outward villain, and I try to make the outward villain sort of a coin flip of the hero. And this is pretty typical, a pretty typical technique. Very famously, it's done in like movies like The Dark Knight. But you see this in Gunmetal Gods, where the villain is a fully developed character. He has his own perspective, and you don't even have to think of him as the villain. He's a protagonist in his own right. But he's an absolute overwhelming force in the way of the protagonist. And for me, it's all about dialing up that conflict, because it's just something that I feel like, it makes the story sort of, as a writer, it makes the story write itself. Like, okay, if this person is going to do this, then this person is going to do this, and then they're just reacting to each other, sort of playing tennis, and they're just trying to, sabotage each other. They're going after the same thing, so they're trying to sabotage each other, or get in the way of each other, or just reach for that thing that they're both going for. So for me, that's what sort of generates the whole book, and it's just underlying to how I write. And in one way, it turns people off because the villain has half the book to tell his story as well. And Micah the Metal, for example, in Gunmetal Gods, a lot of people couldn't stomach reading his chapters. But for me, it's just more interesting because the antagonist protagonist dynamic is more interesting when it's real people, and they're both fully justified in what they're doing, and we understand them both.
Hearing you say that really brings to mind the. I guess you could see this is why it's good, because I guess you can call her a villain, but Mada from the Greenbone Saga. So in that series, there's two gangs essentially at war with each other, politically, physically, in all types of wars you can have. And so the main characters we follow, arguably our protagonists, are from one. And then Mada is from the other one, and she's the leader of that one. And there's a certain part in each, I don't want to give anything away, but there's a certain part in a book, one of the books, that I was on her side completely. And then after I read it, I was horrified by myself for being on her side completely. That also happened with Micah. We talked about that, I think, at Live at some point. So I definitely agree that when a villain is almost not a villain, in the sense that you can you can understand what their goal is and why they feel that way. I also find that very intriguing. So I'm wondering, if you can't think of one on the spot, it's totally fine. But if Kian and Zamil and Steve as well, if you guys have an example of a villain that sticks out in your head in the way that Ayatmata sticks out in mine still to this day, I'm wondering who impressed you as a villain?
Based on what Zamil was just saying, it reminds me so much of the Demon Cycle by Peter V. Brett. And it's really that of having two opposing perspectives of neither of them being necessarily villains. I would argue one of them is a lot more questionable than the other, but you do have people where you see their story, you see their motivations, and even after seeing something horrendous that one of the character does, you see their reasoning in the next chapter, and it's like, okay, I can see what kind of brought you to that. And it really much is that. I think, that's what they say. A villain is somebody who always think that they're doing the right thing. It's, it's your Killmonger from Black Panther sort of character. Yeah. But Demon Cycle, it resonates so much with what Zamil was saying.
The one I always think of is Breaking Bad. That's what I always go back to when I think of villain, and I think of Walter White as the villain of the whole story, and it's just it's just textbook. It's just a textbook way of how to make you sympathize with someone who is doing so many awful things, but you fully understand why they're doing it, and in a way you support them. You want them to succeed. Even though they're doing all these awful things, you want them to succeed at it. You're rooting for their triumph, no matter what they're doing. And I think that's sort of human nature, because we all like to think of ourselves that we're very moral, and if we see something is wrong, we're going to call it out. But in actuality, we're tribal. So if we see someone that we empathize with, that we can put our shoes ourselves into, and even if they're doing something wrong, we're going to try to justify it in our mind. So sort of, that's very much what I did in Gunmetal Gods as well. But just the whole idea of that is very compelling, because it's sort of a struggle within human nature where we're trying to be moral, but we have these blinders on when we empathize too much with someone, and we'll forgive the bad things they do. We'll overlook it, and we'll justify it for them.
Coming here, I told him this before, but what I like about his character is the protagonists and antagonists are both worthy of sympathy. You can understand why Micah the Metal is the way he is. Very true. And read my mind, Ruka from the Ash and Sand trilogy. That's what he stole my answer from me. Good stuff there. Because Ruka does some pretty terrible things in that series. Villains or antagonists who feel realistic, has layers to them, works really well because it helps in understanding the human nature. Abercrombie comes to mind, and Mark Lawrence, The Girl and the Stars as well.
I haven't
This is why I
gotten
love
to
Grimdark,
Girl and the Stars.
honestly.
Sorry, I
This
cut
is
you
why
off
I
there.
love Grimdark, because other genres don't explore villainy in the way Grimdark does. So, it's something, it's why I'll always read Grimdark, no matter what is popular. Um, Grimdark explores this just so well. And it's, to me, it's just, it's one of the reasons why I read.
What's interesting is I think you're right that Grimdark is often the one that does it, but another series that comes to mind for me is the Dandelion Dynasty, which we recently had some conversations about that. I wouldn't call that Grimdark. Would you, Steve? Would you?
No, I think it's more of like historical fantasy, maybe, or epic
Maybe.
fantasy. Yeah.
Yeah, but that one really sticks out to me too. I can't name one villain, really. I don't think. Well, Wall of Storms has one. Wall of Storms has one, but if you think about the first one, not so much.
Yeah. And Fazila mentions Jork comes to mind as well. I think that's from Mark Lawrence's series, right? I think the character.
Yeah, Broken Empire. Yeah.
Broken Empire. No. And Kian, I read on your bio that you tried to convince your parents to watch that R-rated movie about vampires and werewolves, and I had to ask what that movie was.
You really caught me on the spot.
Here I am.
I think
yeah.
I think the one, like, I wasn't specifically the one movie that I remember, which was the case where it's like I really want you to watch it. My parents were like, "No, you can't do that." Was Blade Trinity. And it was with Ryan Reynolds and some other characters. And looking back, it was a terrible movie. But you're a kid. You want to see all the gore. You want to see the swear words. And I remember my parents said no unless I get good grades. So me being a rebel, I woke up really early in the morning at like 4:30 or 5 in the morning to watch it. And I got caught red-handed by my mom. No regrets, though.
Yeah, I would have gone the route to getting good grades first. No, I'm just kidding.
No, that's too much effort.
Got to be a shortcut.
Exactly. But it's interesting. I do think, when you're a kid, you want to see the spectacle. You want to see all the action scenes and cut out all of the... Now it's the complete opposite. I want, the emotional bond to be there. I want to see people connect, and I want to see good characterization. And kid me would be so disappointed. But I think it's, that's the hard thing to write, good emotional scenes.
Bring up an interesting point, because I think, like, for instance, like the superhero genre, it seems like the spectacle, those types of big, huge movies, or like that type of storytelling, it seems like that's getting less and less popular, and then people are gravitating more towards like a TV show on Netflix or on Amazon or another streaming service that is a little bit more stretched out with more of the emotional beats. Is that something that you've all have noticed too, or is that just me?
I'm terrible at watching movies. I'm just going to put that out there to start. But yeah, I guess I've noticed like what I hear people talk about is more character-based, in-depth kind of Netflix series or something of that to that effect. But I mean, one franchise that I just will never understand why it still exists today is the Fast and Furious. I don't understand how that's still good. I don't get it because
you know what? Don't tell anyone, but they just had a casting call for the next Fast and Furious movie here. So
that thing has 15 lives. I don't understand. It's the same story, and then they just say we're family, and then it's over. Like I don't get it. I
sometimes you want to turn off your brain and just like
yeah.
And just
okay.
I mean,
sorry. For me, that's what like James Bond is. He's not going to die, kind of thing. Maybe it's like that.
But
did you watch any of the latest movies, perchance? Yeah, I
I
mean,
made
like,
it through 3, I think.
you're not wrong. I totally agree with you. But I will say that I think the only reason it's successful is because it understands that it shouldn't have gone on for that long, and it just became a parody of itself. And it's very aware of what it is, and it does that well, and it doesn't try to be something else. And I think that's why the Transformers movies end up being so bad, because they're trying to have an emotional beat, but they don't realize that they should also go the parody route, because that's kind of like where they're headed. Yeah.
Didn't they go to
They
the
get-
moon or something in the
I
last
know
one?
it.
Well,
That's something I
helpful
heard.
context. That's helpful context, because I think the last clip where I gave up, I don't know which number it was, but they like parachuted their cars out of a plane or something, and I was like, I'm done with this. So maybe that was a parody moment, and I just didn't have the context.
Yeah, they're very aware of that. I because I love this question. I do think part of the issue as well is that Marvel they're recycling the same story beat that they've started like from phase 1, and that's become trite because they're not trying to reinvent the wheel. Yeah, no, absolutely, Tiago. And but you do have stuff that is that I think you can. I don't know. I think I could go on and on, but I'll leave it at that. I do think that the bigger issue with Marvel is just the fact that they're not really trying to take risks anymore, and that is what is a real shame.
Yeah, I think people want exploration. So in a lot of these Marvel movies, they have themes and ideas, and they only flirt with the themes and ideas. Whereas if you watch a Marvel show like Daredevil, for example, which is one of my all-time favorite shows, they take these themes and ideas and they explore them for 12 episodes. And you get an intense exploration of what it's like to be a blind crime fighter using echolocation in a city that's completely corrupt to the core. You explore every level of that corruption, starting from the minor thugs, you go all the way to the top to the kingpin. So it just explores what like a Daredevil movie might just like, on the surface kind of show you. It explores it in depth. And that's why I think that format is so good. And the Marvel movies are, like I said, I'll watch them when I just want to just sit like this and, my brain is completely off. I'll watch them, or when I want to laugh or something, I'll watch them. But some of the Marvel shows, and I haven't seen the more recent ones, but I remember Daredevil just hitting hard with exploring a lot of these things that I wish superhero stories would explore.
Or even to your point, Zamil, I don't know if you saw the Punisher show, and I was a little bit disappointed overall with that, but that explored PTSD and some other issues too. So it had a little bit more time to kind of peel back a little bit and see. And, our friend Paramithis here, she had a question for the panelists. Is there a book which made you feel, I wish I would have written this?
That's a great question.
She Paramita always has the best questions.
Thanks for doing that job for us.
Yeah.
If you guys need a minute to think, I can say I'm not a panelist, but I recently finished Piranesi.
Oh.
The prose in that book is just, if I could write any way, I would want to write the way that Susanna Clark wrote that book. It's gorgeous.
I've heard good things about it.
Oh man, I'm going to be rereading that over and over again. It's so good.
Yeah. I want us to be friends, so all I will say is that I didn't enjoy it so much, but I'm glad that you did.
We can have a heated debate offline if you'd like.
For sure. When I was younger, I did wish that I wrote Harry Potter to get all of that sweet cash, but I no longer feel that way for very particular reasons. No, I don't know, because any book that I read, I don't ever think I wish I wrote that. At most, I will feel envious of somebody's prose. Sometimes I make a mental note of like, that is awesome prose. I need to remember that. Zamil actually, the first chapter in, there was a line that really stuck with me. And it went something along the lines of, it was the difference between something along the I'm paraphrasing, but it was it's the difference between like a clean tongue and a brown tongue, which referred to like. And I thought that was yeah. But anyway,
I can't remember it exactly either. It's something like a truly loyal person knows the difference between speaking
sharp
truth
tongue probably,
and just like a brown tongue, just like flattering someone. So if you're truly loyal, you'll tell them the truth. You won't flatter them. I guess that's just it. Yeah.
Yeah. And otherwise, I just get inspired by something that I read, and I'm like, that is such a cool concept. I want to see if I can do something with that. For example, An Alternative Village Green that I recently finished, it didn't click for me at the beginning, but actually what it was several different short stories set in the same universe within a overall flowing narrative, and I thought that's genius. Maybe I want to do something with that idea in the future. I think that's so clever, so I don't know, just new and original. But yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I feel this way a lot. I was reading your book and I was like, well, how does this guy write this kind of prose? Like, how do I get to this level? So I'm happy that you say that about my prose, because honestly, when I was reading, I was like, shit, left off my game. But yeah, for me, it's mostly about ideas. It's like I was reading. Maybe a lot of you have seen the movie, but I was reading the book Annihilation, and it's like such an intense, like, cosmic horror concept. And I was just like, man, why didn't I come up with this, like, whole idea of, in the movie they basically enter this world which has been transformed by like an alien entity, and it's like totally bizarre, and it plays with your concept of what is like just what is normal, and I was like, oh man, and whenever I get inspired by these things, I tend to put them into my own story. So I'm not like the kind of person that says, oh no, I'm not going to steal this idea. My thinking is like, no, I'm going to take this and transform it. So like, that book actually, what it did was on my mind, and I sort of put some of that into the next Gunmetal Gods book. So. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
That's cool.
Thiago, wait, didn't Marvel movies stop at Endgame?
Oh, he's right, obviously.
Yeah.
It was all a dream.
It was all a dream, yeah. Paramita Piranesi is very good. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a top favorite and a masterpiece.
Yeah.
That book is a chunker. I have it on my shelf somewhere. It'll get read one of these days.
Been wanting to get to that one day, but it's not going to be soon.
Fazila, can you all give some recommendations for lesser known books with great characterization for antagonists and villains? Great question.
Is a really good question. I happened to see it, so I was like, oh, can I think of any? I haven't yet. But I'm trying to think lesser known, right?
I think anything indie would be sort of lesser known.
You know what? While I'm thinking of an answer, Thiago is here. I think Touch of Light does have something which is a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more original, in the sense that it's not necessarily the fact that there is one villain, but it is the fact that the status quo has ended and people are reacting in different ways. And you do have individuals, some taking a little bit worse than others, and they make questionable decisions because of that. And I think that that's, going back to what Zamil said, that is more true to life. And I think there's something there.
Whenever I get a question like this, I always draw a blank. What about you?
Yeah. What have I ever read in my life? Like,
yeah.
A book that comes to mind. Oh, go ahead. Zamil.
I'll just mention Along the Razor's Edge by Rob J. Hayes. That one, I really enjoyed the main character in that book, and it's kind of like Breaking Bad, where I feel like the main character is antagonist and the protagonist. I haven't gotten further into the series, but I found the characterization in that novel like super intense and just like a ride, like really awesome.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. It's kind of having both of those characteristics within one person, especially in the first book. Another book that came to mind, which isn't exactly, there's not one villainous character, I would say, but Legacy of the Brightwash by Crystal Matar does a really good job of society being a fantastic antagonist or villain. So it's the societal structure, which has people you could classify as villains working within it, but it's definitely the system as a whole. And that feels very overwhelming and kind of difficult to take on. So I think, even though it's not a character, I think that one also really sticks out to me. I know that I have villains that I love, and for some reason, none of them are coming to my brain right now. What?
It always works that way. I'm drawing a blank too.
That also reminds me of the show. I don't know if you guys have seen this, Chernobyl, the HBO show.
Very good.
Because it's like the system is the enemy. It's not like one individual in that system who you can really point to and say this person messed it up. No, the whole system was just like messed up beyond like, salvation. So it just made the whole situation worse. So I like that. I like that concept a lot.
I think part of the reason I'm also drawing blank is because we're asking about the lesser known books, but I think it's also worth mentioning, if you haven't read it, the Red Rising series does a very good job again on the topic of society. How society, you have one character in specific, which I won't spoil, who ends up becoming such a twisted soul. And yes, it's always great when you have a character whose goals aren't necessarily perceived as evil, but it's just like, not black and white, it's all shades of gray, and you have different characters competing against each other. But in this case, it's actually a really solid, messed up character, and I think that's also sometimes refreshing, just having a character who's not a caricature, who is not a cartoon, but is genuinely terrifyingly evil. Yeah.
This isn't quite lesser known, but I haven't heard many people talk about it because it hasn't had an update in a while. But that would be The Lies of Locke Lamora. That book has a fantastic villain who, it's not just that it's like a mustache twirling villain, but it's a battle of the wits between Locke and this other person. So when the enemy is smart, I find that really, really intriguing. So I loved the villain from that book particularly. I don't know if that series will ever be finished, but fingers crossed for that one. Definitely not lesser known. And then I would say the last one that came to my mind, which was more an internal battle as well. Oh no, I just lost it. I saw it and I was like, oh, that one. Ah, right. Monstrous. It's a graphic novel. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. I have it behind me. Just give me a moment to pull it out. As it's a visual medium, I think that'll help. Yeah. This graphic novel here, Monstrous. It's got like six different volumes out right now. And this is very close to what you were saying about Eska from Along the Razor's Edge, where the antagonist and the protagonist are kind of within this one character. So basically in this world, there's arcanes, which are people who have any magical ability or sense about them, witches, and then those who have nothing. And there's a vicious battle among them, and arcanes are often used as slaves. So it's very bloody, very warlike, but it does have that internal battle where one character is both the protagonist and the antagonist. So really good stuff. Recommend it.
The artwork looks awesome. Reminds me a little of Junji Ito, the artwork.
Yeah, the artwork is really pretty. I'm trying to find a picture or a good one here. Here's one of them. So it's very dark.
Wow,
Oh, cool.
You've got my
color.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, the color. Yep. So
You've got my attention for sure.
yeah, would recommend for sure. It's a little bit. It's one of those books that throws you in, where at first you're like, "What is happening?" But then when you catch up, it's worth it. I think.
Yeah.
Wow. Very nice. So, Kian, what is it like for you this weird period of time where the book is done, but you're just waiting for the release day? What is it? What emotions are you going through just waiting for that day to come?
I think part of it is just obviously impatience, and what's getting me through it a lot is, okay, I'm going to confess something to everyone here, and I do this in the spirit of transparency. I quite often it's just a lot of impatience and me like looking up and saying, "Oh, did any of the ARC reviewers leave any new reviews?" And sometimes I go on Twitter and I go on the search engine and I just type in the name of the book just to see if anybody put in an update. And then Nick Borelli is currently reading it and he's loving it and he's almost done. And I've been very impatient. And I do that sometimes. And I see like, oh, he made a post 3 minutes ago. I'm not going to click like on it yet because that makes me seem needy. So I'm just going to wait for 24 hours and then I'm going to press like and just pretend it just popped up on my feed. And it's, yeah, I'm just really impatient, but I'm also so excited. I love seeing people theorize and come up with theories. And I know Nick, for example, is really excited to take part in the discussion with you guys.
Oh yeah,
because he's like, I have so many theories and I have nobody to discuss it with. And I think most of it right now is that I already have kind of the outline. I say outline, but I know what's happening in book 2, but I'm still also waiting for people to get back to me of what they enjoyed from book 1. And for me to know how exactly to tackle the events that are going to take place in book 2 as well. In the meantime, it's just writing other book stuff and just, getting ready to start book 2, getting ready for that launch day and just preparing, getting out posters and just, twirling my thumbs and hoping for the best.
Yeah, that must be so nerve-wracking. It is. Yeah, it must be so such a weird middle period there of just kind of waiting.
I imagine all of us are guilty of the actions that you just admitted to. I saw that post literally 2 seconds after they posted it. I'll come back, and like it.
That makes me feel better, a lot better.
Oh yeah, it's like it's rather than it being 3 minutes, it's like 32 seconds ago. I'm like, I should probably wait.
Yeah, just give it a minute.
I will be honest, it was actually more like 30 seconds ago, and I just to give myself a little bit, don't seem too desperate. I'll say 3 minutes, but it was really 30 seconds.
Well, from a content creating standpoint, if we send out like I love this book or whatever feedback we send out, if the author likes it, right, that's like
makes our day. Yeah. Yes.
So
it's like little me,
Yeah.
Feels good.
So if you wait a day, I'm like, did Kian see my tweet or did Zamil see my tweet and just like ignore it but if you get it quick, it's like, all right, like that's kind of like Cloud9 all day.
Now I feel very self-conscious for very different reasons, so now I have to go out like all of his tweets.
No, Nick is great. Nick he's wonderful. So I'm sure it would make his day too. Fazila commented, Taylor, your recommendation of Brightwash made me think of Rebecca Crunden's work. I would recommend her The Outlands Pentology, and These Violent Nights has the system society that's problematic.
Okay.
And Paramita has a question for Kian. I've just visited your website and read about your book. Fascinating premise. If it's not a spoiler, how did you choose a bard as your main character?
Yeah, so this is for my debut novel, which, in case anyone's confused, is not 11th Cycle. It's a fantastically underwhelming epic. So the book for that one originally started off as a writing prompt on Reddit. And the premise was like, oh, you are a hero who picks up a skull of an old wizard. The wizard is dead, but super powerful, but can't do magic anymore. And they keep berating the protagonist. And I like that. And I was reading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at the time. Yes, Tiago, you're absolutely right. And The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy had this kind of like a satirical tone to it, and I was getting a little bit burnt out by the same old fantasy a little bit. So I wanted something with a little bit more parody, a little bit more self-awareness, and self-deprecation. And it's like, okay, a bard is usually a character that's more associated with fun times and charisma and D&D and stuff like that. And I think that's why I went for a bard, somebody who can entertain you, somebody who can be more deceptive and get perhaps our coins that way. And that was the main inspiration for that. Yeah. But thank you for the question.
And Chago says, Kian got inspired by me for the bard, and he tells me I'm average all the time.
That is so not true. I think it, but I don't ever say it. No, I'm kidding.
It must be so great it seems like the indie author community is a really tight-knit group for the most part. I think the camaraderie there is really really good to see. So, I would imagine it's a really good resource to tap into as an author when you need someone just to kind of talk to someone who has been through the same things and bounce ideas off of and get advice from.
Yeah, I mean, after being more involved with page doing and stuff like that, I've been lucky to get a bit more involved with that space. And I will say it feels different from other spaces in a good way.
Writing is a lonely thing, so it's nice to have other people suffering through it with you. It's a lonely thing. It's a difficult thing. It can be torture, but it's when like Kian wrote like a 240,000 word book. So that's not that unusual in fantasy. But where else are you gonna find people who write these big books? Like when you tell a normal person, I wrote like a 700-page book. Normal person, they're just like, what? They think it's like the most. You erected like the Eiffel Tower or something, But another writer is like, I wrote a 300,000 word book, so
yeah.
So it's like,
That checks out. That checks out because I started a whiskey and books group, and the people who are authors in that group, the most posted whiskey from all of those people is Writer's Tears. I don't know if you know, there's a whiskey called Writer's Tears, and they all have it. So that checks out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is. I think Zamil is the first other author that I had the pleasure of meeting in person, and I think there's something to be said about the fact that you just get to sit with them and vent and talk about how difficult sometimes it is, be it the marketing aspect or the writing aspect. And, I'm genuinely looking forward to, going back to Dubai and planning to meet up with Zamil and him having me like ignoring my phone calls and, just the entire process. And I don't know, there is that sense of solidarity of like, oh, what it's like. And it does feel great for somebody to be like, wow, you wrote a big book. Great job. But it's also nice to have somebody else who's like, I know what that's like. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Zamil, you mentioned normal people, but I think there's something to be said for that because a lot of people just scan headlines and that's their reading for the day. They don't even read the article. They just look at the headlines and that's where they get their news from or their updates or whatever. So it's, it's kind of just like scrolling through Twitter or through another site and just not getting the full context. So I think most people do like 700-800 pages or, it's like 300 pages. That's a lot. But for us, it's like, that's an afternoon.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people who see these shelves are like, are those dictionaries? Like they're not, what are those? And I'm like, they're books. And like, why? Why? So
are those weapons? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Well, they could be, I guess.
Yeah. Kian, will you make the artwork for 11th Cycle available for purchase?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am planning to. I currently have 3 pieces of official art from 3 different artists. I will, if the sales go really well for 11th Cycle, I'm absolutely planning to do more official pieces of art. I am currently looking at doing official prints that people can order. And I'm also looking at maybe doing t-shirts and stuff like that with the art as well. there's nothing official yet. You're free to sign up for my newsletter and all of that. And once it does happen, I will absolutely be putting up a shop for the posters and all of that.
A question for both Zamil and Kian. How with the recent changes, I guess you could say without getting too much into it, over at Twitter, how much has that changed your opinion, or have you always thought of kind of like a newsletter or your own website? Has that changed your approach to that at all? Just knowing that a social media platform can change or can disappear tomorrow, has that changed your outlook on that at all, or has it always been the same?
Yeah, I had this realization right from the start, because I used to use Facebook for other things, and I always noticed that they were changing the way that you reach your audience, and eventually they made it so you couldn't reach your audience without paying. And so I knew from that point on that this is sort of the course that social media goes. They monetize, 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 and you are not, you are like, you know, just there to make them money. They don't really care about you and your audience, and you as a brand or as an author are just there to make them money. So the difference with a newsletter is that these are emails, and no one can take away your ability to email someone. Although your email can be blocked and whatnot, and sometimes it goes into spam, but you have much more control over it, and it's if you write a compelling newsletter, people will read your newsletter, and they'll read it every time you put one out, as long as it's not like too much and you're spamming them. And so I've found, over the past few years, this is the absolute best way to retain fans and to communicate with fans. And and email sounds sort of like an old-fashioned thing, but I don't think it is. I think it's still relevant, and I think it still is a way to save yourself from these crazy things that like Zuckerberg or Elon Musk are going to do to their social media platforms.
What about you, Kian?
I'll say it like this. I erected or I put up my newsletter on my website the day after Elon Musk's acquisition, just because it's like, okay, you never know. And, what was it? Goodbye Twitter was trending and all of that. And I think that does instill a lot of people with anxiety and panic. And it's such a shame because I only recently joined the Twitter community, either this year or end of last year. And you guys have been so lovely. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have met Zamil and all of that if it wasn't for this community. And, going on Mastodon, it's not the same for very specific reasons. People are talking about Hive, and I think it's, I will say this, you don't expect it to happen, that the social media site that you're using to go down until like you start seeing it happen to you. Not that it has gone down, but it's more like, yeah, you see the possibility of it happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As a content creator, you always you want to have a copy of your stuff for yourself, right? Because YouTube could just take your channel down, or YouTube. What if YouTube went away? Sometimes I have those terrifying thoughts. I'm like, wow, all of that work, So I can sympathize with that feeling of wanting to make sure you have a backup, So.
Pardon me, I had a question. Zamil, from your website, how awesome is Dr. House?
Yeah, that's another show where the protagonist is also the antagonist, and you watch them spiral into these crazy places, but you're supporting them and you're rooting the whole way. So I wrote a blog post on that. I wrote it like 10 years ago, so good that you're asking about it now. It's a long time ago.
But it's on your website and it's still there, so anyone can go and read it.
There you go.
Yeah. It's proof right there. And one more question for you guys from Fazila. How was your book publishing journey like, Kian and Zamil?
Not all at once. That's exactly what I was about to say. You took my quote.
It's a journey, and it's not always it's not always a good time. It's not always a high. There are a lot of lows. When you're first starting out, it's very exciting. But now I'm on my fifth full book, and you get you feel fatigue, and sometimes you have to motivate yourself in different ways other than just inspiration. So, it's like every other journey. It's got ups and downs, and you just hope you'll get somewhere awesome by the end of it.
Yeah, compared to Zamil, I'm still very much a newborn when it comes to this stuff. It's still I'm in the exciting phase that Zamil just mentioned. I published the fantastically underwhelming epic just over 2 years ago, and it was crazy. I landed on the front page of Reddit because of people being lovely, and I got like 700 book sales in a few days for a debut novel, an indie debut novel. That was crazy. I got my first job offer, and I got a audiobook publishing deal with Podium Audio that like
Wow.
Zamil also has, and ever since then it's just been going up and up and up. And now I work full time as an author, working as a residency writer, where I get a salary and I write books for them, and I put several books now, which hopefully start coming out next year. And it's mostly that. It's just been excitement, and I think there is a sense of pressure of like once you start doing really well, people start expecting quality from you, and I think that is daunting. And you never need to lose sight of the fact that like you're writing books that yes the market wants to read, but at the end of the day that you also want to read and you want to enjoy, and I think that's what keeps it going when you discover the story alongside everyone else. Yeah.
Nice. Well said. And so Taylor, since we've had Zamil on before, did you want to take the last question? I know you have your signature closing question.
Well, Zamil might have answered this actually, maybe with the Death Rider thing. If you have, you can call me out on it. But I always ask the same last question because I personally am obsessed with mythologies and origin stories, right? So I love hearing the origins of things, and that includes people. And so I'm always curious with our guests, what story has inspired them? It doesn't have to be from your childhood. It doesn't have to be a book either. It could be a video game. It could be, a movie, a TV show, or a book that has inspired you and made you into the writer that you are today. If there's any story that sticks out.
Did you ask me this question before? Because
I was about to say, I'm pretty sure you've gotten this one.
yeah, that's when I think of this question, yeah, I think I really have to go. I really have to go back into my childhood and just think about what made me want to be a storyteller in the first place. And I think this is sort of a cliche answer, but in a way, it really was just like something as simple as watching Star Wars, for example, and just like the very basic hero's journey, the very basic concepts of protagonist and antagonist, and the science fantasy setting, and just all these things. Just um, I think because I watched it at a very early age, and it just sort of absorbed into me. And then, ever since then, we go on a long journey with in regard to what we read, and our tastes grow and develop, and we like more complex stories now, and all that. But you're still sort of looking for that original feeling where you were swept up in a narrative, and you were just, it's almost spiritual. It's like you're just so, you know, absorbed into this narrative, and it becomes larger than life, and it becomes meaningful in a very intense way. So yeah, for me it was just basic like Star Wars, Star Trek, just these things that I would watch when I was really young. My elder brother would have them on, and I would just be sitting there watching, and just I was really young, and these are some of my earliest memories. So yeah, that would have to be it.
As for me, I think part of it was when I was very young and I wasn't very academically gifted. But whenever we had creative writing classes, people were kind of waiting to see what I ended up writing. And I think that was the first time I was like, oh, maybe you're not so bad at this. And I got into fantasy specifically when I was always really into it, but I think Mark Lawrence kind of like sealed the deal. I read the Broken Empire series and I was just hooked. I loved it so much, and I started going off from there. I really enjoyed Anthony Ryan. I really enjoyed Peter V. Brett, and I've just continued on now. And I think the indie scene is what has fascinated me the most as of recent. Yeah.
And Paramita made a liar out of me. One more question for everyone. To all the panelists, say you were granted a wish to meet one author who is no longer with us. Who would you choose, and what would you ask them? For her, Oscar Wilde and I ask, how do you write so perfectly?
That's a really good question, and I can't think of any authors that have passed right now. These are such good questions. I wish I was good enough to answer them.
I would probably ask J.R. Tolkien how it feels to have been such a huge influence on everyone. If you knew that he would be such an influence.
Yeah, he would be so humble as well. Like he quite often he was so hard on himself. Yeah.
I would probably ask Charlotte Bronte what she was thinking for the end of Jane Eyre, because as someone who's read a lot of Victorian books, that the end of that book, I don't understand why people like it. It infuriates me. So I would want to ask her, this book is so good, why did you end it that way?
So you'd bring her back from the dead just to ask her why she ended that way?
Absolutely. She owes me. Just to lambast her. Yes. Welcome back to life.
I'm gonna undermine your expectation, and I'm gonna say, whoever wrote like Gilgamesh or Homer or so not Homer, Gilgamesh or the Iliad or the Odyssey, I want to ask them, like, where did you come up with this stuff? Because I'm very interested in mythology, so I would want to know, like, how deep does it go in human history? Yeah, so that's probably that. If if there's like a genie who came to me and offered me this, I would go deep into history.
Yeah, I was thinking of the author of Gilgamesh as well. Gosh, that's a really, really tough question. I honestly do not know. I really, really can't say. You know what? I do have one answer. I think I'd love to meet Lovecraft. Like towards the later point in his life where he wasn't such an anti-Semite, but I would really have loved to talk to him about, I don't know, like a lot of his idea for like what his cosmic or horror concept was, and I would also let him know that he becomes a cult classic in the future. Yeah.
He died penniless, right? Or he died like in.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't die. I think he married rich, and he wasn't so conservative anymore towards the end of his life. But he still was never really known beyond like a small niche of people. Ended up becoming a huge cult classic though later, and I don't think he would have ever expected that. Yeah.
Good answers.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
So the time always flies, and I know Taylor's getting into the wee hours of the morning. So,
Okay.
we want to thank everyone for their time. It's always a pleasure, Zamil, to chat, and Kian, it's been great to talk with you, and looking forward to our discussion for the 11th cycle in about a month or so. So we're excited. to break down that one with you. But Kian, if people want to get in touch with you, where's the best place to find you?
I would say just go onto my website, www.kianandardalan.com, all one word, no periods there. You can also just find me on Twitter under at Ardalan Kian. And yeah, just look me up on Google with my name, and I'll be the first one up there as well. You can also look up my 11th Cycle. That'll also help you find me.
Yeah, and Kian's website is in the description of this video, or if you're on the podcast, it'll be in the description too. So Taylor, where's the best place to find you?
You can find me on YouTube, my BookTube channel, May Between the Pages, written as it says below. You can also find my reviews on Before We Go blog, run by Beth Tabler. It's a fantasy review blog for people who don't know. You can also find me on Twitter. My Twitter it's not intuitive, so I'm not going to spell it out, but it's linked. It's always linked in my BookTube videos, so you can find it there. That's probably where I'm most active. And I'm page chewing, of course, with Steve and Kiel.
Yeah. And Zamil?
Go to my website, zamilakhtar.com. Sign up for my newsletter. My Twitter follow links are there as well, at Zamakhtar. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I hope it doesn't explode. But if it does, my newsletter is the safe place.
Nice. And of course, for me, I'm always here on the channel. So if you're here, then I guess you kind of know where to find me. And it can also be found on pagechewing.com on our blog and forum. And of course, on Before We Go blog with Taylor and Beth and PL and a bunch of other wonderful people there. So thanks everyone for coming by. Kian and Zamil and Taylor, thank you all for your time. It's always a pleasure, and it's always great to chat. And thanks for everyone in the chat to interact with us and ask such wonderful questions. It makes our lives a lot easier. So be sure and check out the website. Sign up for newsletters. They're very important, so they help out the creatives a lot. So be sure and check them out. So hope everyone has a great day, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Thank you guys so much.